Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. It's a pleasure coming back together again for another NRRI Author Spotlight. We're very fortunate to have Scott Hempling with us today, talking about his book, Regulating Mergers and Acquisitions of U.S. Electric Utilities, Industry Concentration and Corporate Complication. I'd like to, just before we jump into Scott's book talk, give you some very exciting news about some of the things that we've been up to at NRRI. You've all probably heard us talk about the Regulatory Training Initiative. It's our effort to try to reach out to the regulatory community, commission staff, commissioners, utility personnel, stakeholders, and to try to help provide training. This process began a while ago, and at the time we thought that remote training would be a good idea, and post-COVID it seems like it's a good idea. So want to let you all know that we've just completed our first course, An Introduction to the Theory and Practice of Regulation. That course had 8 classes, and each one of them is available on the NRRI YouTube station. And please feel free, download, listen to the classes. If you have questions, please send them to us, and we'll engage in some conversation with you about that, and try to provide you with more materials with respect to the various subjects. So we're so fortunate to have Scott with us today. Scott well, first of all, Scott was the executive director of NRRI, where I'm now the director, and from the staff who worked for both me and Scott, I have a lot to be appreciative of, because he set a standard of excellence that was really a tribute to the quality of his thought and work. Scott's been an attorney, an expert witness, an author, and a teacher for many years. As an attorney, he's assisted clients from all industry sectors, many public utility commissions around the country. I still hear from various commissioners how helpful Scott was, generally during some very difficult times that the commission was navigating through, and they are all appreciative of him. He's testified before Congress, before commissions, and he's a true expert, but he's also meticulously organized, and he has taken on the subject of mergers with great gusto, and he is produced a marvelous book that gives totally new insights into mergers and the way in which regulatory commissions can view those mergers. In today's lecture, Scott is dividing his time into 3 separate segments, each covering a different aspect of the book. After each segment, we'll be happy to take questions, and if there are no questions, then we'll move on to the next segment. But I think that you will agree that we're all gratified that Scott has shared his expertise with us, both in writing, as an expert witness, and today as our speaker. Scott?
Yes, thank you very much, Carl. First, thank you so much for the work that you and Sherry and Victor and the others at NRRI are doing to carry on this great cause of which you and I and the others are both a part, which is to regulate in the public interest. And thank you to NRI for having me today. Carl, if you would just nod and verify that you can see the outline that I'm going to use here today. Carl, I'm just looking for you to nod your head up and down. You can see the outline. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me to speak to you about mergers and acquisitions. I'm going to talk to you about the 4 parts of the book. First, I want to talk to you about the transactions themselves. I want to describe the transactions. Secondly, I would like to talk about the harms that come from these transactions. Thirdly, I want to talk with you candidly and respectfully about what I consider to be regulatory lapses in the way commissions address these transactions. And then fourthly, we actually have 4 parts. I will turn to solutions. And as Carl said, I'm going to try to time this so that we can leave a few minutes for questions after each part. I've left a larger segment for questions at the end. And with NRI's permission and mediation, I'll be pleased to take email questions after this session is over. It's a big topic. It's a 600-page book. I'm going to do my best to work at a pace that you all can absorb the thoughts that I want to share with you. So thank you again for the opportunity. Let's start here with the first part of the book, which describes the transactions themselves. I've described these transactions as sales of public franchises for private gain, undisciplined by competition, producing a concentrated, complicated industry that no one intended. I should say at the outset, so that people don't run to their cell phones, I don't oppose mergers in general. I oppose mergers that are not consistent with the public interest. So this book and this presentation today is not anti-merger, it is pro-distinguishing mergers that serve the public interest from those that do not. A quick word on terminology. The 2 words that I'll be using most often this afternoon, acquirer and target. Acquirer is the entity that is buying the stock of the to-be-acquired utility, and target is the name of the utility whose stock is being told. Well, you think we're talking about mergers, but in effect, these transactions are acquisitions. We are changing the entity that controls the franchise. They can be described and designed as mergers as a legal matter, but as a practical matter, what is changing is control. Control of what? Control of the public franchise to serve electricity. And by the way, the book is about electricity mergers itself, because that is the area that I professionally have focused on. So I'll start with chapter 1. Each of the 4 parts of this book comprise in total 13 chapters. In chapter 1, I talk about the diverse strategies that have a common purpose. The common purpose is to sell a public franchise for private gain. So understand, please, the transaction's essence. What's going on here is we are transferring control of a government-protected franchise. What do I mean by franchise? The legal right to be the sole seller of the particular service within a state-defined geographic territory. Franchises are granted by state law, either by state legislatures or by state commissions using state legislative authority. Understand that what the strategists, the promoters of the merger, the buyers and the sellers of these franchises, what they're buying and selling is a market position. And I will contrast throughout this afternoon competitive markets from monopoly markets. Understand that in an effectively competitive market, market position, where does it come from? It comes from merit. But in utility monopoly markets, the market position comes from the government when it grants an exclusive franchise to provide an essential service. That exclusive concession, that franchise, is providing the target with a stream of predictable earnings. And you've had teachings already on how to establish those earnings. That's what you do when you set rates. But the transaction's purpose, because we're talking about transferring control of a government-protected franchise, the core purpose that is shared by the acquirer and the target is to monetize, specifically to monetize the government-granted franchise. We know that the target's goal is to sell control of the franchise for the highest possible price. How do we know this? Because the proxy statements that the target files at the Securities and Exchange Commission, as compelled by law, always reveal, and I've read many of these proxy statements, that the CEO of the utility is acting as an auctioneer. She's working the phones. She's pushing bidders to raise their bids until all but one drop out. That's the target's goal, to sell control of the franchise for the highest possible price. Now, what's the acquirer's goal? The acquirer wants control of that utility's predictable earnings. Essentially, it wants to buy customers who were made captive by the government's decision to protect the target from competition. Now, the acquirer then can use that monopoly position as a platform. And I've seen this in the testimony. We need a platform from which we can, quote, grow our company. The acquirer is buying a franchise to get a platform from which to increase its earnings, and consider the multiple paths by which those earnings can increase. We have the acquirer buying a new market position. Maybe it's the Canadian company AltaGas buying Washington Gas and Light, buying a market position in the high growth, high income Washington, D.C. area. There's a desire to increase the acquired utilities rate base. There's a desire to balance business portfolios. Sometimes the acquirers have risky assets in their portfolio. What better way to balance that portfolio than to buy a monopoly, which has predictable earnings set by government, designed by law, constitutional law and statutory law, to provide a reasonable opportunity to earn a fair return. So the acquirer's goal is to buy customers. The mutual goal between the target who's selling the franchise at the highest possible price and the acquirer who wants to buy customers and wants to buy a platform, the mutual goal is to monetize a market position. Now, you have some supporting stimuli. We hear often in these merger cases, well, everybody's doing it, so I have to do it. And also, ladies and gentlemen, low interest rates. Just like when low interest rates can drive up the price of houses, because with low interest rates, the monthly payment for a higher priced house is the same as it would be for a different house with high interest rates. Low interest rates stimulates the merger market. We have CEOs on record saying, this is a great time to sell because with low interest rates, I can get a very high price. So supporting stimuli include everybody's doing it, low interest rates. You haven't heard me say anything about customer benefits yet. And the honest reason for that, colleagues, is that customer benefits are not the reason for the transaction. As I will discuss, customer benefits are used to sell the transaction to regulators, but they're not the core purpose. The core purpose, once again, is to sell the franchise for the highest possible price and to get the acquirer control of customers from which it has a platform. Missing from the transaction's purpose is customer benefits. We know this, again, because acquirers are competing for the target's favor based on price, not on performance. Understand that when the transaction's primary purpose is monetizing a monopoly position, the customer benefits are going to be incidental. In fact, what we also know is that the higher the price paid by the acquirer, the less resources it's going to have to provide benefits to the target's customers. And so when we hear about customer benefits in these transactions, they're serving a regulatory strategy. They're not serving a transactional purpose. Now, this is different from the old days. When I first dealt with mergers in the late 80s and early 90s, many of those mergers were adjacent companies seeking economies of scale. That is not the purpose of today's mergers. Turning to the second major chapter and the second topic, missing from utility merger markets is competitive discipline. Again, I wish to contrast mergers in competitive markets from mergers in monopoly markets. What we have in competitive markets is that, and I mean effectively competitive markets, is that the target's desire for highest price and the acquirer's desire for new earnings, these are all disciplined by a simple fact. The merged entity's customers can shop elsewhere. They can tell the merged company to fly a kite if quality goes down or price goes up. So the competition among sellers for the target's customers, that disciplines competition among acquirers for the target's shareholders. So when you have market pressures, all three interests are aligned. The acquirer's interest the target shareholder's interest and the customer's interest. But a monopoly market is different. There's no competitive discipline because customer freedom is missing. And monopoly markets don't penalize suboptimal performance the way competitive markets do. And that is why then, in the absence of competitive pressure, means that merger negotiators can subordinate customer benefits to shareholder gains, yet suffer no loss of earnings. Bottom line here, competitive market mergers create new value for customers. Monopoly market mergers are more likely to divert value from customers. And I'll discuss that value diversion in the second part of this conversation. Now, the last point I want to make before I turn it to Carl to see if you have questions is this. What has been the structural result when we have these diverse strategies but common purpose, selling franchises for private gain, and in a context where we don't have competitive discipline, what has been the structural result? Well, we have concentration and complication. Let me show you a few diagrams so I can illustrate this. Give me 1 second to call up what I've got here. Just 1 second, please, while the speaker fumbles. All right, here we go. This is table 3.1 in the book. Hopefully this is visible to you. This is a list of FERC. I use the FERC merger approvals because almost all mergers go to FERC, whereas for any particular state, there's going to be only a subset. So this is a history of mergers from 1986. Well, I'm just flipping through this. I know you can't see if I go too fast. Here we are in the 90s. There's Consolidated Edison and Orange and Rockland. There's Sierra Pacific and Nevada Power in the late 90s. If it's italics, it means it didn't happen. It was proposed, didn't happen. Here's the first of several Pepco, where I live, mergers. All they headed down to, we're getting to the third, fourth page here. It all goes down to 2000. Let's see, I had to turn over the book to the publisher, so I don't have the very latest, but we take it right down to Nextera and Gulf Power in 2018, NMAX and Emera Maine in 2020. There's about 80 transactions, colleagues, on this document. And what you can see is that the mergers have been intra-regional. You're now looking at a page from the book, intra-regional, inter-regional, and international. A few more diagrams I want to show you before I turn it back to Carl. So here we have the inter-regional. Well, we got Berkshire Hathaway owning company utilities in Washington State, Washington State, Nevada, Oregon, California, Utah, Wyoming, Iowa. Exelon owning from Illinois to New Jersey. AEP owning from Ohio down to Louisiana. Duke from Kentucky to Florida. Excel from Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. You have these international holding company systems. Fortis from Canada owns 3 utilities. Emera from Canada owns 2. Iberdrola, now in the news, proposing to acquire Public Services in Mexico, owning several utilities up in New England. National Grid from the UK, quite a collection there. Gas Metro from Canada, Green Mountain Power, and Central Vermont Public Service. What we have here is a concentration of the industry. Let me give you some numbers to explain that. And then finally, Carl, I will turn it over to you. Before the 1980s, most electric utilities were standalone, local, pure play. Today, the 10 most active acquirers now own what used to be 64 independent utilities. 83 formerly independent utilities are now owned by 13 holding companies. Today, only 14 remain unmerged. And what I argue in the book is that this picture doesn't resemble anything that anybody chose. It was not anybody's vision in the 1980s, in the 1990s, or any point in time that we would have the industry looking this way. I haven't talked about the ramifications yet for consumers, for competition, but the point I want to make is that the result of the diverse strategies, the absence of competitive discipline, is a structural result in terms of concentration and complication. that nobody intended. With that, Carl, let me press a button here if I can find it. 1 second, please. And stop sharing. And now it'll be you and I on the screen, Carl. And I have about a minute or two for some questions.
Well, thanks, Scott. We have a couple of questions here for you. And the first is I really appreciate the differentiation between a merger and a competitive versus a regulated environment. Could you just say something really briefly about the approval process of a merger and the competitive versus the regulated environment, or the different standards that need to be applied for that?
I'll have to be very, very brief. I do have a discussion in the book about merger standards. Actually, it shows up in the tutorial. For those who get the book, not everybody's an electricity expert, so I have a 40-page tutorial in the back to give you an introduction. Now, in the context of competitive markets, or let's just say unregulated markets, it's essentially antitrust law. Antitrust law focuses on anti-competitive behavior. Antitrust law doesn't fix market defects, but it focuses only on anti-competitive behavior. In the regulated utility context, we have what lawyers call concurrent jurisdiction, Carl. FERC in the electric side has jurisdiction over nearly every one of these mergers. States do also. And it's not a preemption environment. So the merging companies have to get their tickets punched in all of the jurisdictions that are affected, assuming the state legislatures have granted jurisdiction. The standards, I actually will talk about that in part 3, but I'll point it out for now that there's a generic public interest standard without a lot of definition. The lack of that definition is one of the problems that I'll discuss, Carl, in part 3. We have time for another question if you do, Carl.
Let me ask a question from Chairman Randazzo. Scott, congratulations on the book. Can you identify any merger not driven by economies of scale / scope objectives that you believe serve the public interest?
Well, first of all, Chairman, I want to congratulate you on being chairman. I've known you for almost 30 years, back when I could easily call you Sam. Now I have to call you Chairman Sam. But I'm very pleased to get your question. As I understand it, can I or have I identified a merger not driven by economies of scale that serves the public interest? Okay, well, sitting here right now in front of, nobody told me how many people are on the call, but let's assume sitting here in front of 100 people, none comes to mind, but I can hypothesize some because I do want to cover myself here. I can hypothesize a situation where a state is regulating a utility that has performance problems. I'm not going to name names, but some utilities have presided over pipeline explosions, one's in Massachusetts and other ones in California, or the utilities have failed to innovate in the way that they can. And so I could imagine a state commission saying, we would like to hold an audition. We would like to find the best possible performer. We are looking for somebody to improve performance. The issue is not economies of scale. The issue is somebody who's more innovative, somebody that can run a pipeline system without blowing up neighborhoods. Somebody can run a transmission system without causing fires across thousands of acres in California. We're going to hold an audition. So yes, sir, I can certainly hypothesize a transaction not driven by economies of scale, but one that does serve the interest of customers because its core purpose is performance. And again, I want to emphasize that distinction. These mergers have wrapping paper that talk about performance, and I'll discuss that strategy in part 3, but these mergers today are not driven by performance. Carl, I wonder if it'd be okay for me to continue to part 2 now.
Hey, Will, let me just make one quick point on that point, and that is San Diego, the city of San Diego is investigating reissuing the franchise to San Diego Gas and Electric, and they're looking at alternatives which could potentially lead to a merger in terms of providing better customer service. We do have a couple more questions. I'm going to try to fit them in as we go along, so please proceed.
Yes, and of course, I saved extra time at the end for the questions that we don't get to. So thank you for that, Carl. So I'd like to return, colleagues, to major part 2 of our conversation today. Let me get my outline back up here. All right, and that is to discuss 4 categories of harms. 4 categories of harms: economic waste, diversion of franchise value, distortion of competition, and hierarchical conflict. Now, I'm going to start this part of the conversation with an acknowledgement. So don't run to your cell phones. My acknowledgement is that no merger, and I've personally been involved in over 20, whether as a litigant, as an appellate counsel, as an expert witness, and as a staff advisor to commissions, as an outside advisor to commissions. I will acknowledge without hesitation that none of these mergers has caused a crisis. None of these mergers has caused a crisis. But as I will describe in our next 20 minutes here, that's not the standard that I recommend regulators use. Avoiding disaster is not the purpose of regulation. The purpose of regulation is performance. And so the question I want to address in these four chapters, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, is, do we have a process of merger review and a process of merger formation that is not maximizing societal benefit? So let's start with this notion of economic waste. I argue in chapter 4 that suboptimal couplings cause economic waste. I said this before. When a target chooses its acquirer based on price rather than performance, when the context is a monopoly market that lacks a competitive markets discipline, we know that the highest price acquirer won't necessarily be the best performer. The highest price acquirer might just be the person with the most cash in the till, or it might be the company that has strategic objectives that can most benefit by owning a monopoly in a particular place. So what we have is a source of economic waste because better performers lose out to higher payers. Now, commissions either overlook this misplaced priority or they accept it as normal because, as I'll now discuss, the standard that most commissions apply is harm avoidance rather than insisting on the most cost-effective couplings. Let me drill down a bit into this concept. You will find in nearly every state that the essential standard by which they judge mergers is no harm. Now, let us compare the way investors think with the way commissions think. What is the investor's standard? Highest possible return given the risk they want to take. We've all got portfolios somewhere, whether it's your state managing your pension fund or whether it's an individual like me managing his or her own portfolio. We've all got a standard, which is, in light of the particular set of risks we want to take, highest possible return. That is not the commission standard. I have yet to see, and I have read, studied hundreds of merger cases and read merger opinions for years now, and I have yet to see a commission say our standard is highest possible set of benefits for the customers. What we have is essentially a no harm standard, some minor variations. Some states say no harm plus a defined benefit, no harm plus some undefined benefit. Some states, actually the FCC says harm is permissible if it's outweighed by benefit, some benefit, not clear how much. So what I also want to say to you is that you all do rate cases and you know the concept of prudence. Well, no harm conflicts with classic prudence analysis. Look, suppose you had a utility that had a worn out $10 an hour widget, okay? $10 an hour, meaning it cost $10 an hour to operate. Well, it buys a new $10 an hour widget when an $8 an hour widget of equal quality was available. Now, if the utility CEO got on the witness stand and said we were prudent because we caused no harm, she'd be laughed out of the hearing room. Okay, you're supposed to do the $8 an hour thing. So my argument is that when states apply the no harm standard, where acquirers are applying the let's maximize return standard, you're going to get lopsidedness in terms of the allocation of gain from these transactions. I'll also suggest, and this is more detail than we'll have time today, that when commissions actually count the benefits to make sure that the benefits at least equal the costs, they often count them incorrectly. Now, a benefit that truly is dependent on the merger, that is caused by the merger, well, that's appropriate when verified and when the utilities are taking the risk of its non-appearance. We can't have speculation substitute for real benefits, not when there are real merger costs. But so often, colleagues, the merger promoters talk of benefits that are actually achievable without the merger. And standard antitrust law, and in my mind, standard logic, is that when companies are offering benefits that are achievable without the merger, well, that's just merger strategy. The economics underlying the merger aren't producing the benefits. And so when a statute says that the commission should determine benefits that arise from the merger, commissions make a legal error when they are counting benefits that are achievable without the merger. So that's the concern I have with economic waste. Second, in Chapter 5, and this gets a bit complicated, so apologies for abbreviating it, the merging parties divert franchise value from the customers who created it. Let me proceed carefully here for a moment. I want to start by explaining the control premium. Now, when an individual investor buys stock, what is she buying? She's buying only a sliver of the company. That sliver gives her no influence. So what does she pay? She pays only the market price. But what's going on in a utility monopoly merger, in an acquisition? Well, the acquirer is buying more than stock. The acquirer is buying control. So the acquirer is paying more than market price. That's why they pay extra, because they're not just buying the stock, they're buying control. That's what makes them different from the individual investor. Now, that excess of purchase price over market price is the value of control. We call that the control premium. When I say we, not just me, the industry calls it the control premium. It's the price paid for control. It represents, I'm saying it a third time, I apologize, it represents the value to the acquirer of controlling this exclusive government-protected franchise. Now, the typical allocation, that control premium, this is in the billions. All right, this is the mergers that I've been involved with. We've had control premia at 1.2 billion, 1.6 billion, and the transacting parties assign 100% of that control premium to the target shareholders. Well, why not? They're selling the control. Why shouldn't they get 100% of the gain? It's their corporation. Well, hold on. If one looks at the sources of the control premium's value, you will see that they are largely, well, I shouldn't say, somebody will take this out of context, pardon me while I type in front of 100 people, they are largely unconnected to the target utility's merit. What do I mean? Look, the real reason that this franchise is valuable is because the government has passed laws granting the franchise on an exclusive basis. So you have captive ratepayers, their monthly payments, the certainty of receiving them, the control of that franchise, that value is created by the government. And it's supported by captive ratepayers. It's not attributable to meritorious performance by the target company. And then there's the acquirer's expectation that regulators might continue, if they are already, setting the target's rates above reasonable cost. That's what the rate case game is always about, is the company trying to get acknowledgement by the regulator of cost levels that are above the reasonable cost so the utility can keep the difference. Now, this is going to be slightly complicated, but humor me, please, for 30 seconds. Acquisitions are funded by a combination of equity and debt. But what happens when you are buying a company with debt? What are you buying? You're buying the equity in the company. Now, when rate case time comes, you're going to have the regulator set returns on the equity that you bought. And you're going to hope for maybe a 10.5% return. But if you have bought that equity with debt that didn't cost 10.5%, but maybe cost only 5%, if you have incurred debt at 5%, and you're going to get a return on the equity that you bought with that debt at 11%, well, you're making some good money. That's why you're going to pay a premium, because you're buying a promise of returns set by the regulator that exceeds your acquisition cost. That, again, has nothing to do with the target shareholder's merits. It has nothing to do with the performance. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that if a company has a great service reputation, its executives are excellent, they've kept their regulators happy all these years, they're innovating, and there's an expectation of strong profits over the next 30 years because of that excellent performance, I will be the first to acknowledge that that is a legitimate reason to pay a control premium and a legitimate reason for us not to worry about it. But to the extent the sources of the value are these other things, and you can actually do calculations to separate it out, to the extent the source of the premium's value are these other things unrelated to performance, we have a diversion of franchise value from the customers who created it to the target company shareholders. Now, I have had argument against me in cases that says I am depriving the target shareholders of their constitutional right to just compensation. We don't have time for me to give you the whole constitutional analysis. By the way, the witness that has always opposed me on this is not a lawyer, and I can tell from his writing, he's a very erudite man, but he does not know his constitutional law. I will tell you in brief that the shareholders have no automatic constitutional or statutory right to the entire control premium because they don't have a legitimate expectation created by government that you can buy and sell franchises at a gain and keep the gain when the value underlying the gain has been created by government. That's a much longer discussion worth having. I do take the constitutional argument very seriously. I teach law, I practice law, I intend to remain a member of the legal bar, so I cannot, and the Constitution is our sacred document, may our elected representatives respect it. And so I do have a substantial discussion there. Turning to the third, and very briefly, because it's a long and complicated chapter, and many of you on the call know competition analysis quite well. Mergers can distort competition. Why? Well, because mergers change market structure, and market structure is influential on industry performance. Mergers change market structure, right? You can have horizontal mergers that reduce the number of competitors, vertical mergers that give the merged company control of important inputs. And since regulation's purpose is performance, and that is our purpose, the purpose is performance, policymakers, both legislators and regulators, need to understand how mergers affect performance. Again, I apologize for not giving this more time, but I will point out this contradiction, which is compelling. We're in an era which is characterized by a desire to decentralize supply. You wake every day and you pick up your trade press, and we're talking about distributed generation, storage, demand aggregation, microgrids, community solar, decentralization of supply, and also diversification of supply sources, right? As between storage and nuclear and coal and gas and wind and solar and geothermal. What else can we learn as we decentralize? And this is happening at the same time that we're presiding, the same commissions, presiding over consolidation of control. I hope that I can call attention to that contradiction and help us think about what to do about it. Lastly, before I turn to you, Carl, in terms of our four harms, hierarchical conflict. Remember that at the top of the merged company is a holding company. Well, the holding company has no statutory obligation to utility customers. May I say that again? A holding company has no statutory obligation to holding companies, to utility customers. So its private, for-profit aspirations can conflict with its utility subsidiaries' public service obligations. Let's not kid ourselves. There is conflict between the parent and the utility, business differences, and then hierarchical control. Well, you can understand the substantive conflicts. Let me just give a prominent example for which I was a witness before the District of Columbia Commission. Well, back in the late 90s, as the DC government introduced retail competition, it either persuaded or mandated, I can't remember now, it's been 21 years, either persuaded or mandated Pepco to sell off its generation. So for the last, for the next 15, 16 years, Pepco has had no generation. Now, why was that desirable? Because the commission and the city council wanted to introduce competition, and it didn't feel that in the same corporation, there should be the monopoly service of distribution and also the competitive service of generation. So the DC government did the brave thing. It required or induced a separation of the competitive business from monopoly business. The generation was all sold off. And this became the very foundation for introducing competition at retail. Well, along comes Exelon as a prospective acquirer. Exelon is a generation company. Oh, yes. Well, it's got six, as of now, it's got 6 utilities. Back then it had, I think, just 3 before it acquired the Pepco group. But what that merger was going to do was to convert Pepco from a wires-only company into a minor subsidiary of a major generation owner. And so you're going to have a conflict because a wires-only company wants low generation prices and a generation company wants high generation prices. And there went the DC Commission, colleagues of mine whom I deeply respect, but I testified about this and respectfully disagree with the outcome. In fact, they completely ignored the point that was made in the testimony that you had a policy of separating generation from monopoly services, and now you're going to approve a merger that contradicts that policy without even a word. It's a concern. It's one example of a substantive conflict. Pressure for growth. Well, your utility is going to become a smaller and smaller member. Look at public service in New Mexico. It's down there by itself. If it's acquired by Iberdrola, it'll be a small part of a multinational conglomerate, Spanish-owned holding company. I'm going to stop there, Carl, because I'm at the point. I'll just quickly point out that there are a few other topics in the area of hierarchical conflict. There's a risk of merger overcharges because why? The acquirer has to get its debt paid off. And there's the non-utility business risk because the acquirer, I mean, Warren Buffett has got an awful lot of different kinds of companies in Berkshire Hathaway, and those risks can be visited on the formerly independent utilities. So with that, Carl, let me stop share, get you back up there, and let's spend a few minutes on questions. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Scott. I thought your point on the conflict of interest between the holding company and the local distribution company was particularly on point. Having spent a lot of time in California post the move to competition, it became clear in talking to some senior utility executives that they were looking at how to create rules for them to compete nationwide as opposed to how to protect their distribution companies. So we do have a few questions here. The first is, have the promised consumer benefits resulting from mergers been realized in all cases? I guess, I would add to that, do commissions go back and evaluate the benefits from mergers that have been promised?
That's a very good question. Certainly some merger, quote, benefits, close quote, have occurred. So, when Exelon acquires Baltimore Gas and Electric and Pepco and says, we're going to send $100 to every customer as a way to persuade the commission, and that $100 refund shows up on your bill, yes, that's right. And when Exelon, for example, says, we're going to build a headquarters building in downtown Baltimore, and you can see the building go up, then yes. Unfortunately, both those are examples of, quote, benefits, close quote, that are not necessarily derived from the merger itself. The headquarters building has nothing to do with the merger. There is a question about what's called synergies. You'll hear that word a lot. Well, yeah, when you merge 2 companies, you don't need 2 CFOs. You don't need 2 shareholder relations offices. You don't need 2 directors of ITs. These are minor, and I'm sure that commissions have found that those are savings. But I've argued in the book that the big picture, right, the small tangible savings we have, but the big picture in terms of the loss of economic gains that you would have if you merged based on performance, those are not tested. And the fact is, I say this in part 4 of the book, no one, this is FERC and the 50 states, no commission that has approved a merger has gone back years later and actually asked the question, are we better off? Plenty of states have approved their second, third, and fourth mergers without asking whether the first merger made them better off. Carl, back to you.
Very good. Well, which leads to the next question, which is, I guess, from Washington State. My state has a net benefit standard for acquisitions and mergers. In practice, though, this has meant that the utility makes concessions or payments to appease opponents. How do you define net benefits?
Well, thank you for that question. Again, I want to be respectful. I mean, I've made a living advising state commissions and appearing before them for all these years, but I am critical of this. So yes, there are people who have made the distinction between a no harm standard and a net benefit standard. And without intending to be flip at all, a net benefit standard defined literally is no harm plus $1. The problem with the net benefit standard is that it doesn't define the type of benefits or the quantity of benefits that makes the merger consistent with the public interest. And that is why I contrast these transactions with the way investors think. Investors don't think about net benefits, they think about maximum return on the investment. And so the net benefit standard is not something that someone can hold up to say, I'm thinking about the consumer with the same amount of passion that the investor thinks about their return. And yes, as I do argue in the book, to satisfy that net benefit standard, which can be simply no harm plus $1, what we often get, and I have lists of them in the book, including Washington State's approval of the, was it the Scottish Power acquisition of Pacific Corp back in, or it might have been Oregon's, it might have been Oregon or Washington State's approval of Scottish Power's early acquisition of, was it Washington Water Power or Puget Sound? I can't recall, but there's a whole list of thingies in there that, were certainly beneficial to the people who wanted them, but they are not attributable to the merger itself, Carl. I think perhaps we could take one more question and then I'll move on to the third topic.
Sure, let's do that. Which is, isn't your argument about buying equity with low-cost debt a matter that can be sorted out in regulators' capital structure return decisions? Is trying to litigate this in an M&A proceeding really a sideways criticism of PUC setting too generous returns?
That's a superb question. It's a technical question, and I want to give a two-part answer. And I know that there are maybe many people on the call that didn't quite follow that, but they will if they can read that portion of the book. Again, the concern that the questioner was asking about is when the commission gets to rate making and it's looking at return on equity, should the commission decide that the portion of that equity that is attributable to debt, that was acquired with debt, should we assign to that portion of the equity the lower cost debt return rather than the higher cost equity return? That is a debate that people are having. There's pros and cons to it, but the direct answer to the question is yes, that problem can be sorted out in the rate making process. But if you allow the merger to go forward based on the acquirer's expectation it's going to get that big return, and then you slap them across the knees in the rate making process, you're asking for a lot of trouble now in terms of a weakened company. And so I've argued in the book that we need to set out in the merger proceeding itself the way that return is going to be calculated so that everybody knows the deal. I am not in favor of surprising investors. I'm an investor myself. That's how I can afford to do the kind of work I do these days. And so I don't like uncertainty. I like government to step up and say what it's going to do. So that is my answer to the question. I am a person who thinks that utilities should not be getting a return at the equity level on equity purchased with debt. There are other people that disagree with me, and there are people who are far more expert than me who can talk about it. But I do think that we have to make the decision clearly in the merger transaction stage. In fact, I'd rather have it be in the commission's rules or anybody gets a bright idea about how to finance a merger. And the result is I'm not looking to penalize utilities. I'm looking to make sure that we get the transactions whose core, whose foundation is excellence and not financial engineering. And that word financial engineering is exactly the term that finance people use to describe using debt to purchase equity. With that, Carl, if I may, shall I go to part 3?
Yes, please do.
All right, thank you, sir.